welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Lyndal Curtis. Today our program is devoted to foreign affairs, and we're joined now by our regular panellists in this space, Green Senator Lee Rhiannon and Liberal MP Josh Frydenberg. We'll go first to Malaysia's decision to deport independent Senator Nick Xenophon on Saturday after he arrived at Kuala Lumpur Airport for some meetings with democracy, opposition and government members. Senator Xenophon was held at the airport for several hours before being put on a plane home. When he arrived in Melbourne, he said his visit was not intended to be a high-profile exercise.
When I was invited by the Bersih, which is a Malay word for clean, the Clean Elections Movement, it's a leading NGO. Ambika Srinivasan, who runs Bersih, former president of the Malaysian Bar Council, came to Australia. I hosted her visit in October last year. She met a number of MPs. She reciprocated with an invitation for us to go there. The opposition leader, Anwar Ibrahim, welcomed us to see for ourselves as Australian MPs, including Steve Georgianis, as to what was happening. And the irony, the great irony here is that this was meant to be a low-key meeting. The only media we were planning to do was with Jim Middleton on the ABC's Australian network, and that was going to be done by Dr Mal Washer, a Western Australian Liberal MP.
Josh and Lee, welcome to the program. Josh, if I could start with you first, is there ever a reason for a country to deport an elected Member of Parliament?
Look, clearly in this case, I think it's unacceptable that Senator Xenophon was deported from Malaysia. Let's remember that he was invited there by a parliamentary reform organisation, and he's taken a keen interest in Malaysian politics. And let's not forget that the same Malaysian party, the party that has formed government, the UMNO, has been there since 1957, so there hasn't been much change in terms of the leadership in Malaysia in all that time. And he was deported based on the Immigration Act, where he was deemed to be a national security threat. And as an elected member of the Australian Senate, Senator Xenophon does not constitute a national security threat. So I think the Australian government was absolutely right to raise their concerns at the highest level with the Malaysian Foreign Minister as well as with the Malaysian High Commissioner in Australia.
Lee, Nick Xenophon's been quite outspoken on issues of Malaysian democracy. This was an unofficial visit though, one he organised with three other MPs, one from the Labor Party, one from the Liberal Party and one from the Coalition. In retrospect, would it have been better to try and make it an official delegation, an official parliamentary delegation, to have the support of foreign affairs and embassy officials in Malaysia?
There's no indication that that would have necessarily solved this issue of an Australian senator being deported. And we have here, as Josh has identified, a government that's been in power for more than 50 years. And lately I've heard that there have been some advances, but this is really quite a setback, and it really does put the focus back on the Malaysian government to ensure that there is real freedom of the press, the human rights are not abused, because we do get reports that when people are detained by the police that they often can be very unpleasant and they can be assaulted, and there is these critical issues coming into an election because there is these extraordinary situation that electoral constituencies can vary enormously. So a leader of the opposition can have about 100,000 electors in their electorate, whereas a leading member of the government has only about 7,000. So there's still a long way to go, and the work of Australian MPs is very important.
I'll ask this question to both of you. Firstly, is there more a country like Australia can do to encourage the ruling party in Malaysia to be more open to criticism, to accept criticism and deal with it the same way governments in Australia deal with it?
I think so, and I think Australians expect that. Like, the world is not just carved up into nation states. We're not just in a little bubble in Australia, and I think particularly in our own region we do have a responsibility. And I actually would hope that our Foreign Minister, Mr Carr, and the Shadow, Miss Julie Bishop, would make stronger statements. Basically, they just said they were disappointed. That was the strongest that I read in terms of their response to the expulsion of Senator Xenophon. So I think that we do also need statements and involvement at the highest level, as well as what effectively from backbenchers.
Josh, is there a way a country can do that encouraging of openness and acceptance to criticism without being seen as lecturing another country?
Absolutely, and that's what back channels of communication are for as well, because, as you say, Lyndal, by doing it publicly can be counterproductive and have the reverse effect that is intended. And we have a very good relationship with Malaysia. I mean, we're members of what is called the Five Power Defence Arrangement agreement with them. We've got a very strong trading relationship, and we've obviously got strong people-to-people and education links as well. So there is a lot of bilateral engagement between our two countries, and I think we can use our good officers to talk to the Malaysians, and certainly about the Anwar Ibrahim case. We've also made our concerns patently clear at the highest levels of government, both this government and its predecessor.
We might move on now to the case of prisoner X, a suspected Australian-Israeli Mossad agent, Ben Zigir, who was arrested and secretly detained, then died in an Israeli jail in 2010. Overnight, Israel has rejected reports Mr Zigir had contact with Australian intelligence services before his arrest, and released a report on his death saying there's no evidence anyone else was involved, although Mr Zigir was supposed to be monitored 24 hours a day. Josh, the bottom line, though, is we don't know why Ben Zigir was arrested, do we?
No, we don't, and we're all operating in the dark here. There seems to be, different stories that are about as to what his activities were, how much did the Australian intelligence agencies know, what have they told us. I mean, in the case of Bob Carr, he said one thing and subsequently now he knows another, and he's been caught out here. So, for us, sitting here in your studio trying to guess what the real story here is a little bit dangerous ourselves, because we don't know, other than that it's a human tragedy. An Australian overseas has taken his own life, and that is a human tragedy, and we should understand the concerns and respect the privacy of the family too.
Lee, given Israel itself has been so secretive about this issue, there was a gag order on the case for quite some time, which has now effectively been lifted because the news couldn't be kept out of Israel. Do you think that there is a case, at least for Israel, to inform the Australian government of the circumstances of Mr Zigir's detention?
Yes, as Josh has identified, an Australian has died overseas in Israel, so clearly there needs to be a full explanation. At first we hear it's allegedly a suicide, then a question mark is put up about how anybody could commit suicide in the prison where he was held. But there also does need to be greater disclosure on the Australian side here. I note that former Foreign Minister, Mr Alexander Downer, said that he thought that it was not just a leak to ASIO in terms of the what's involved in this case. And this case, let's remember, we go back to 2010 when we first start hearing about this, and there was the assassination in Dubai, and there was Australian passports that had been used by the Israeli Secret Service to assist for the agents were using Australian passports in some way. So there's so many unanswered questions in terms of Australian involvement, what's happened to Mr Zigir, and then what happens in Israel.
Josh, if I could ask you, what's the sensitivity of the government in Israel, particularly surrounding the issue of using fake passports, using the passports of countries that are friendly with Israel, and the potential that then opens up for abuse of the passport system itself?
Look, I can't answer a question that should be directed at them, Lyndal. All I know is that no Australian passports should be misused. We need to protect the integrity of our passport system. And, this case obviously is, quite disturbing in terms of the reports that have come out. And as Lee and I have both said, tragically, a young Australian has died overseas, and, that's going to be very painful for his family. So, I just do not know what the facts are here. We've been told very little by the Australian government, very little by the Israeli government, and we're all sort of playing around in the dark.
We might move on now to a story around last week about foreign aid cuts resulting of a shifting of aid money to housing asylum seekers. The humanitarian and emergency aid budget's been chopped by about $70 million. There are cuts in assistance to the Pacific Islands, to Indonesia, education programs in Indonesia, water and food programs in Africa, programs in Indonesia. Lee, is this a case of the government has a pot of money of a certain size, and some things have to be chopped?
Well, they didn't have to be chopped. The government has taken more than $375.1 million all up from the budget for this financial year. And this is money that Australians understand would have been used to alleviate poverty around the world, programs caring for people that would deliver better water systems, greater sanitation, education and health programs. And here we're seeing the government saying that they need that money for looking after refugees in Australia. Now that clearly has to happen, but it shouldn't come at the expense of carving up the aid budget. And meanwhile, we also see the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Abbott, he's been circling like a shark looking at the aid budget just last week with that ill-advised program about lots of dams across Australia, and it was suggested that the aid budget could be a way to find the money for that. So we really do need to ensure that aid money does go to alleviating poverty.
Josh, I'm sure you'd like to respond to that. Could I also ask you, what is the Coalition's position on what are called the Millennium Development Goals, which is having aided a certain percentage of gross national income, the government delayed reaching that goal by, I think, about a year. What's the Coalition's position?
Look, we support the Millennium Development Goals, and as you point out, they strive to get a higher percentage of GNI, gross national income, directed to aid, and we support that. And the Millennium Development Goals also includes a whole lot of other poverty eradication or mitigation and alleviation strategies, and also about child health and maternal health, and also environmental policy. So we support the Millennium Development Goals. In terms of the aid budget and the decision by the Gillard government, I mean, it just shows you how desperate they are to find the cash to pay for the ballooning costs of their border protection failures. And we're talking more than $6 billion they've had to find because they haven't stopped more than 30,000 people coming to Australia in an unauthorised manner. And as a result, good programs are going to be losing money. And you know, it's quite ironic, Lyndal, that now in Australia, in our aid budget, Australia is the third largest aid recipient from the aid budget. Number one is Indonesia, number two is Papua New Guinea, and number three is Australia. So this is not a good use of our aid budget, and it shouldn't have come to this, because the government should have got our border protection policies right.
And that's where we'll have to leave it. We've run out of time, but Lee Rhiannon and Josh Frydenberg, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Lyndal. Thanks, Josh.